Stacia, you can't tell right now, it's pretty quiet, but just a half hour ago, supporters upstairs at the ACLU of Ohio who backed Issue 5 already declaring victory, saying they're confident that this amendment will now be enshrined into the city's charter, creating an alternative crisis response team, changing how 911 calls are handled in the city. Now, we have been talking about this all night, but just a quick reminder, this would essentially create a third arm to the public safety response here. So instead of fire or police responding to certain non-emergency calls, you would have trained social workers and behavioral health specialists responding in those situations. And supporters here say this is a long time coming. They say this is needed in Columbus, but I did also hear from some residents who voted no on this issue. They say they are concerned that while right now this amendment is not raising taxes, there is no tax increase tied to this, they fear that maybe down the road, because this is in the city's budget, that it could raise taxes. They also say this could add an unnecessary layer of bureaucracy onto public safety. But supporters I talked with here say they are confident this will create a more fair and just and safe city in Columbus, including Council President Shannon Hardin, as I mentioned, who was confident this was going to pass tonight. And as I said, even though we're still waiting on all the results to come in, supporters here tonight saying that this is going to be law here in Columbus. Of course, Stacia.
You know, I did have a question. What did the police associations and unions feel about this?
This is a very good question. So we talked to Brian Steele, the president of the Capital City Lodge 9 union here representing Columbus police officers. Now, he said at first he had his reservations on this. He thought this could be another way to inadvertently defund the police. But after sitting down with city leaders, he says this is actually going to perhaps help their officers focus on responding to violent crimes and really put their efforts there, while these non-violent emergencies, they can have trained mental health specialists respond there instead. So at first he had some hesitations, but now that police union president here in Columbus on board with this.
And Libby, is it correct? I think Council President Hardin said the other day that also the fire union is on board with this.
The fire union is on board with this as well, and that's a point he made here tonight, that you see all these groups coming together supporting the Columbus Safety Collective campaign, which backed this amendment, but you don't really see one organized opposition group here like we've seen with other issues on the ballot. So Shannon Hardin saying that police are on board, fire on board, and he hopes that residents that may have voted no tonight, as this gets fully operational, it will take time by 2030, but he hopes they will ultimately get on board as well.
I'm fascinated by this.
I think it's really interesting.
I know this is a Columbus thing, but, you know, coming from Cleveland, you know, we have seen so many bad outcomes when it comes to police trying to handle mental health situations. And I believe this is first in the country
to put
for
it in
Columbus.
the city code,
yes.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm fascinated by the outcome of this.
I'm interested to see if it catches on after this. I can think of two instances. We had two Toledo police officers who were shot and killed in a situation where I think this would actually be very helpful. So I'll be interested to see if other towns and municipalities and cities follow the results here tonight and start to think of something like this.
And
interesting also because the FOP was really hesitant about this initially, and they spoke out about that because this is called a non-police public safety plan. So they were initially very concerned about what this actually would look like in practice. And once all of these groups came together, then it was kind of like an, oh, okay.
Probably actually will help the police.
I mean,
do their work.
Hear police, because we all know law enforcement officers, different people in our lives or people who we've interviewed, and they've had those experiences where this was not necessarily part of their training, but it is part of policing today in so many ways. And so this is meant to be that other arm of what the community can offer to folks who are in crisis. And it's interesting to see how all these groups have come together once they found out more about it, what it would actually look like.
Yeah, and Shannon Hardin has been pushing the anecdote of, if someone's breaking into your house, you want a police officer there. If your house is on fire, you want a firefighter there. And if someone in your family is having a mental health crisis, then you want a mental health professional there, and that's what this would do.
So we're looking at the division up and running in 2028 with 24/7 staffing by 2030. So it is going to take time for this to be enacted in this way. But again, we're already seeing some success in Columbus with this.
There is some of that
Right.
that groundwork that's already been laid
Wow.
to push this
be watching
forward.
that.
You know, by how much did it pass? Do we know?
I
Was it
think
over
it was
100?
70 to 30 at least.
Big time.
That's
We're
amazing.
still seeing the crisis response,
I think I'm
kind of
putting
where
everybody on
things
the
stand with the
I think I
precincts
did see
reporting.
70-30.
Yeah, we're going to look
trying
that
get
up.
but it was pretty substantial, I believe, because there wasn't a big organized effort against it either. And
Correct.
the ballot measure, at least as Libby was saying, this time around was not asking for money for it. That it's in
Was
the
there
budget.
something that caused it, do you think?
78-22.
78-22.
78 to 22.
I think,
Okay.
was there something that spurred this suggestion when
I don't think it
came
was
about?
one particular incident, but the Columbus Safety Collective was the one that was behind the effort to push this. They had a petition that they said collected about 30,000 signatures that they then took to city council to say, hey, this many people want something to be done about this, let's make a deal. And then they started working on the wording and talking to the police
But you're
and
hearing
fire unions.
the
and everything.
city is coming together, the fire, police,
Unions.
and they're
Yeah.
saying,
How often does that happen?
and we don't need more money from you at this moment.
And it was people driven. It was citizen
If only
driven,
we could
too.
do that with education.
With all of it.
Property taxes.
Exactly. So, but I think that was intriguing to people because that is so rare, because these are groups that spend a lot of time back and forth. And so everybody got on board with this. So it is interesting to see there wasn't like a really tight-knit organization against this issue. So they're seeing success with it.
They did a good
We'll
job
be
selling
watching.
it.
We will be from Cleveland and Toledo.
And I bet Cleveland and Toledo's already watching it too. So
There's no cute way to do this, but we've got to transition anchors because Doug and
We-
Dina have to say goodbye.
All right, so we've got our
newscast.
next time we get
newscast.
Zenobia a microphone.
Musical chairs? What were you saying about musical chairs?
That's right.
I can play some Vivek interview. And
We're-
we could do
Wait,
it
I
to
need
make
some
it cute
walk-off
for you guys.
music, okay?
What do you want? I can't play music, but I can sing.
We'll put a microphone on Zenobia. She can sing you off of the desk.
Awesome.
What do you want
So
that?
what she was saying is we need to start transitioning to get ready for our 11 o'clock newscast. So we're going to play a little bit right now of
Party in the USA.
Are we going to play some of the Vivek Ramaswamy
Yeah, we can
interview?
play when
Let's do that
he's
for
talking
a
about the
minute or
property
two.
taxes,
Talking
'cause I
about
think-
property taxes, yes.
David Brianna will join us after the soundbite.
All right, and then we'll bring our political experts back in after we hear from Vivek Ramaswamy, and we'll play our own version of musical chairs here.
We're going to roll back the property taxes to where they were before the end of the pandemic. Pragmatic, common sense, and do it in a way that does not hurt our public schools, does not hurt police or fire, but does roll back a lot of the government overgrowth we've seen in our state. So that's the way I'm going to do it.
How do you make up for the revenue
Yeah.
that won't be coming in?
So a couple different ways. Number one is I do want to root out every form of waste, fraud, and abuse that we already see in the state. We're going to be taking a long, hard look at waste, fraud, and abuse in the Medicaid system, in other areas of government funding where these are people who should not even be getting those funds. And I know that American dream exists because I have lived it. A lot of young people, a lot of people of really every age, don't feel like that American dream is available to them anymore. I'm going to change that. I'm going to fix that in this state with lower costs, bigger paychecks, and better schools. And as an entrepreneur and a businessman, I know how to get that job done. And I feel like it's my moral duty and my civic duty to this state, which gave me so many opportunities that I would have never had in any other country, for me to give back to this state through serving the state, and I'm confident we can do it.
All right, so you were hearing there with an exclusive interview with 10 TV and Doug Petcash, as we heard earlier from the now presumptive GOP candidate for governor, Vivek Ramaswamy. Right after he voted today, he spent a little time speaking with our Doug Petcash exclusively about this moment as the campaign really starts to heat up.
David, what did we learn tonight about Vivek going into November with some of the successes or maybe areas where he needs to focus going into the general election?
I think the biggest issue of concern tonight over at Vivek headquarters will be the percentage against him in Appalachian counties, especially go around the Ohio River counties. It wasn't the 10, 15%, it was 25%, in some cases 28%. And if there's a portion of the state that would represent an opportunity for Democrats, it would be to return to where they had been in Ohio for a very long time, which was very competitive in Appalachian Ohio. And the formula for Ohio Democrats' victory was to put Northeastern Ohio together with Appalachian Ohio and win the state.
Do you think that's because of the billionaire, the anti-billionaire messaging that's going on, because he is a billionaire? Do you think that's why he didn't play as well in those specific areas?
You think about how well can you relate to, somebody living in modest means, somebody living in a very rural community when you're living, the private jet lifestyle. I think certainly that's an issue. And again, folks in Appalachian Ohio, you're sizing up, have you done a hard day's work in your life? Do you understand what my life is like and the struggles of my life? And, I think it's a real issue he's going to have to deal with also on the front of, healthcare. He's a executive from
how does
a pharmaceutical.
A billionaire communicate like that? How does he do it?
Well, normally they buy a pickup truck and they
go to the diner.
And they go to the diner and maybe they get a photo op where they're, shoveling something, some substance of some kind. It's not going to be easy. And especially because his strong suit is the showmanship. It's not the one-on-one,
Right.
I'm one of you stuff. It's the I've got ideas and I'm exciting.
What about Dr. Amy Acton and the uphill battle in some ways that she's going to face as the Democratic nominee for governor, with overcoming some of the messaging people remember from COVID times? And we've already seen some criticisms in commercials playing out. It feels like that's just beginning. What do you think she has to focus on from here?
Well, I think one way that she can spin the COVID narrative is to remind people of the lives that she saved by, releasing those directives and shutting schools down. Like, more people could have died. There could have been more chaos, right? And so outside of that, I think the other challenges that she needs to have is, of course, increase her visibility. Of course, she was running uncontested, and so she really didn't have to do any media appearances and things of that sort. But now she really has to get out there and introduce herself. And she also has to do some more media training, I would argue, because while, I enjoyed the passionate speech today, I'm not sure if it's going to really chart well with general voters as we get into the general election.
And we're talking about two candidates who have never done this before. And they are both brand new on the campaign trail for office, because we did see Vivek Ramaswamy run for president, but that campaign didn't last so long before things kind of, narrowed down. So what are we looking at when you have fresh candidates? In a lot of ways, we're not talking about lifetime politicians, as we've seen in previous governor's races. There's a big change ahead in either direction.
Well, that's right. And especially in Ohio, where, the norm has been these are longtime elected officials. I mean, Mike DeWine
we know they're from other offices.
Current Governor Mike DeWine has been in office since the 70s. John Kasich, the previous governor, had been in office, since the 80s. We're used to folks who have very much been around the bend. One thing that'll mute that a little bit as an issue, of course, is it's true for both of them. Neither one of them has been in office.
Right.
They're not coming from, statewide office or from Congress or anything like that. But the way they think of the job and the way they think of Ohio is so clearly distinct. And, when you hear their messages, his Ramaswamy's is much more of this kind of economic, economic magical thinking of, we're gonna return things to an Ohio of a prosperity of another day. Acton's is much more personal about the individual and the individual's struggle. So it's a, in some sense, it's a glass half full and a glass half empty approach. But both of them are offering themselves as something new, fundamentally new.
We did hear from both of them. It's kind of interesting that they have a lot of the similar things that they're saying so far in their messaging, and that they want to lower prices and better schools. And they agree on both of those things, but I'm sure have different approaches on how to get there.
And need to lay out a plan. I'm interested, looking ahead to November, does Ramaswamy begin to now distance himself from President Trump, who is experiencing lower approval ratings. What do you think going into November for him? And also, sometimes in these midterms, the country goes against the current administration who's in power. So what's your take on that going into November?
I think one of the top goals or priorities for Ramaswamy would be to try and secure an endorsement from J.D. Vance. Right now, I'm blanking on the name of the candidate that managed to get an endorsement from J.D. Vance that was in the primary right now. But I think if he manages to get that endorsement from J.D. Vance, it would signal, still support from the administration, from an individual that is not directly caught up in a lot of the heat that Trump is receiving right now. And if he does secure that endorsement, he can then still continue onward.
Was it Husted you were thinking of?
Good
maybe?
chance,
okay.
Good chance. It was like, it was somebody. But if he secures that endorsement, he would secure both, support from both president and vice president, and that would indicate a unified GOP front. And I think that would also signal to disgruntled voters who would have supported Putsch instead, right, would say, well, if J.D. Vance likes him, well, then maybe I should probably give him a chance, maybe.
What are your thoughts on that?
It's hard to do. In the modern Republican Party, it's hard to create any space between yourself and Trump.
Because you have to identify with people who are experiencing the high gas prices and the property taxes and the affordability, but you're also a billionaire.
Right. And you can't go too far in distancing yourself from the center of the party. And that's the exact same problem that Husted is going to face running for Senate is, he's had to associate himself with Trump to get where he is right now. It's very, very hard to turn away from that, which means you rise or fall. A rising tide lifts all boats. Well, a falling presidential approval, sinks all boats for Republicans.
Well, we did see J.D. Vance tweet this morning, or post on X, excuse me, great to be in Cincinnati this morning to vote for Vivek Ramaswamy for governor, and then went on to say Jay Edwards for state treasurer, and went on down the line for that way. So he is speaking out on behalf of him as a candidate. And so we'll see what that looks like, I think, going forward in the state as the campaign really kicks into high gear. But we also have a really hotly contested Senate race to talk about in this state as well. And we know there's going to be a lot of money spent on this particular race. So when it comes to Senator Sherrod Brown, now the presumptive Democratic nominee for Senate, what areas of the state that we saw with him winning and voter turnout, how does that play into what we're seeing with the results tonight?
Well, I think one of the big challenges that I think Sherrod Brown and the Democratic Party as a whole have to deal with are those changes to the mail-in ballots, right? So no longer do we have that 4-day grace window of having the ballots appear after the election. They need to be postmarked and arrive, right, by the end of day, election day. And so that means, for voter registration folks on college campuses like myself, we have to do some more logistics training and figure out ways to make sure that we have our students who are going to vote absentee to make sure that they drop off their ballots on time or that they're delivered in a timely manner. And it's the same thing for regular voters. They're going to have to make sure that they plan, and actually before they even make their voting plan, they need to go in and confirm that their registration is still active.
Do you think that this was a good test run for that as a May primary where that begins, as opposed to it going into effect for November?
I would argue not really, because primaries are usually for, party activists, the most passionate of folks that are interested in politics to turn out and vote. And since, primarily we're looking at partisan voters in particular, if you're an independent or, claim to be a moderate, you're not going to try and affiliate yourself with any of these parties, and instead you're going to try and wait for the dust to settle and then jump in the game for the general election.
I noticed, Sherrod Brown during his speech tonight was also kind of trying to distance himself from being in Congress, which he was in Congress for a very long time. He was railing on Congress, not looking out for the people, taking all the money. So I thought that was interesting. He's trying to get back into Congress after being out for a very short time. So his messaging tonight, blaming Congress for a lot of the problems we have and being disconnected. But he was in there for quite a while.
He was in there for quite a while. And I think he also he's dealing with a double-edged sword, if you will, right? Because if you're complaining about Congress, a lot of the Democratic leadership that still exists in Congress was there while you were there. And so, people now complain that the Democratic Party has lost their fangs. They're pretty weak-willed right now. And of course, both nationally and I would still argue statewide, there needs to be some sort of revamp or some sort of initiative in place that tries to pump in new blood into the party, both for candidates as well as for the voting population as a whole. And it's unclear to me, what has he been doing to actually participate in that, or has he just been sitting on the sidelines waiting for this opportunity to try and get back in the game?
How much do you think labor support is going to weigh in on this? Because he's always been pretty favored by the Labor Party, but it looks like Houston has picked up some labor support as well. And we saw on Lena's map, she was pointing out that Sherrod Brown he won in all of the major cities. And then in his hometown, you can see the map, I think. Can we see it there? But in a lot of those metropolitan areas, he did very well. But what about the labor? They seem to support both Houston and Brown.
Yeah, so, labor started trending towards the Republican Party, we can say about 2016, and it's been competitive ever since. And so I would argue with the current economic situation that is an advantage for Sherrod Brown right now.
So it kind of goes with wherever the economy goes? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but
affordability.
Selfishly speaking, I don't want the economy to get worse, right? It may make things better for Sherrod Brown, but do we really want to experience all that struggle again in the meantime, just to say that Brown would have a better opportunity?
What do you think he needs to do differently this time? Because a lot of the messaging that we see from Sherrod Brown, it looks very similar to what we saw a couple of years ago when he lost to Bernie Moreno. Do you think he needs to change his messaging, or do you think that there needs to be a freshening of what he's sharing as he's on the campaign trail? Because it looks the same.
So as a voter, I would argue that there should be a refreshing, but, professionally, the academic in me is arguing what he's presenting would work right now, especially since Trump is not on the ballot. One would argue this is more so of a referendum. However, there is still, as I mentioned throughout the night, the fact that he lost. And so there is a lot of concern, I would argue, if he's still running the same playbook as 2024.